Hi, everyone. This is part 2 of a 3-part series with Josh Rossman, VP of Customer Experience Strategy at Oracle. In the last section, we talked a lot about laying the foundation for a CX program. We got into the goals, the team, the design of a survey, and the distribution channels, and a little bit about the sampling strategy. Now we want to get into the analysis. Analysis is a really important part of any successful CX program. This is all about taking that data that you're collecting and turning it into the actual insights, which you will ultimately present to other stakeholders within your organization. So as these leaders are taking over, they're building their programs out, and they're looking to unlock the value from the data. What are some of the common mistakes that you're seeing pop up in your own experience or in consulting other organizations when they build out their CX functions, when they're looking to analyze the results and pull out those insights?
The analysis part of creating insights comes from the data that you collect. And we did spend a bit of time talking about this, but just before we dive in, I want to make sure that people are kind of thinking about where we are. The importance of collecting feedback the right way, it's critical to being able to analyze and interpret what you hear from customers. So there's a lot packed into that first section of making sure that that's done properly. And that relates to the listening posts and the way you architect your surveys and who you send them to and all of those topics. But let's assume today that we've got all that done. And now we're at a place where we're confident that the feedback we have is reliable. We're confident that it's comprehensive and it's trusted. And now we can take a look at, what do we do with it? How do we take what customers have told us and then translate that into a prioritized list of actions that we can take? Really, really important to do that. But if you start to do that without making sure that you've done, kind of the preceding steps properly, then, you'll run into different pitfalls, different problems that might lead you back to re-examining the data collection. So let's assume that the data collection is good, and now we're moving on. One of the very natural tendencies I see companies make is they kind of, first you have to read everything. You have to look at everything. And you start looking at scores and reading responses, or in some cases, if you collect it from video, you're watching responses, or if you're listening to support calls or something like that, you're listening, but you're digesting all of this information. You start to hear themes, and you start to say, well, okay, this topic about difficulty understanding what we're trying to do at this step of the journey, it's coming up here in point A, point B, point C, point D. Therefore, this confusion issue must be important. It comes up all the time. And then maybe that gets shared around the organization, and executives or other people who spend a lot of time with customers say, when I speak with customers, they talk about this all the time too. The pitfall there is that sometimes the noisiest problem is the biggest problem, and it is something that needs to be addressed as a priority. Sometimes maybe it's not. An example I saw, there's a couple of examples, but one of them was a telco that looked at basically the detractor feedback, and by far the noisiest issue was around call coverage. Okay, so and it was some, on the magnitude of like 80% of detractors mentioned this as an issue. And the next biggest on the Pareto chart was 1/10 the size, and it was about overage charges on billing statements. So the tendency and the actions really aimed at the coverage issue. You see this with all the telcos. Like, even in the Super Bowl that was just held a couple of weeks ago here, there was a T-Mobile commercial about coverage. It was kind of funny. I thought it was entertaining, but like coverage was the issue. And in the case that I'm talking about, the detractor topic that actually correlated with customer behavior, with churn behavior, had much more to do with the 8% that talked about the billing issues versus the 80% that we're talking about dropped calls. So that's an example of like trying to take the feedback that you have, listen to it, but then connect it to actual behavior to figure out what matters the most. And then, from there, you can think about the actions that you need to take to fix the problems. But the lesson is that even when you have an overwhelming issue that shows up in terms of like frequency of mentions, that may or may not correlate with behavior, and you need to take that next step to go and figure that out. So I guess to frame that around the way you asked the question, one pitfall is assuming that the loudest voice is the biggest problem, and then another pitfall related to that is not taking the next step of connecting it to behavior to try to really drill in and figure out what matters the most.
And would you say there's another pitfall around related to presentations? So organizations spending too much time trying to get the perfect presentation versus establishing a baseline or just taking action on the feedback that they got?
Well, what I see happen that's related to this, I think, has to do more with trying to create the perfect analysis versus presentation, maybe reflected in the presentation. But when you're really trying to take an analysis like down to perfection, for sure, that can like take away from good enough. And I've been in both environments. I would characterize, programs like eBay where, really heavy analytics, emphasis on goaling, emphasis on data, the idea of getting to a really granular level of trying to almost get to like a transfer function of how much will this specific action deliver to MPS lift. It's very difficult to do. I think that company, when we were there, boy, did we put a lot of attention on taking that as far as we could. And I think they did a great job with it. But when I was in a different environment at McAfee, I remember going into the first presentation to the CEO and to his staff, and I felt like in that readout, we had 80 to 90% of what we needed to get to perfection. And my expectation was that we were going to kind of figure out what was the remaining 10 to 15 to 20% that we needed to address to make it perfect, coming out of this meeting. And it was kind of the opposite. Like the leadership team said, this is good enough. Like we don't even waste your time doing that. We need to just, we need to take this information that we have directionally. It's good enough to understand what we need to do. Now we need to just go execute. Let's go do it. So one of the themes that will emerge as we talk about a lot of these topics is that, number one, there's kind of no exact playbook. We're kind of building half the playbook, the sort of the science that we can come up with, but then, the art of it is a big variable. And, in these examples that I'm sharing with you here, one company culture wanted something different than another company culture. So that's the wild card, right? Like, if you're in an environment where you need those transfer functions, and the expectation is that you're going to be held to goaling against an MPS lift or a satisfaction score, some sort of a metric lift based on the actions that you take, then it's a little bit of a different attention to detail and perfection than if good enough is just that, good enough, and you can go forward if you're 80% of the way there and you're directionally good. So like company culture, expectations of leadership, these are all things that sort of play a role in understanding how much art is involved in applying the science. But, in general, I think you did hit on a pretty important pitfall independent of culture, that like you need content to be useful more than you need it to be perfect. And I think that like idea of utility is what, as a practitioner, you should focus on in any environment. Like what is going to be the most useful for the stakeholders of your work to take action on in your environment. I would start there.
That's a fantastic point. And I think the last pitfall that I do want to ask you about is, why is it important to not turn your customers into numbers? And why should organizations make sure that they don't do that?
That would be a good leading question, right? I think, if you were a customer, would you want to be a number? That might be one way to look at it. But the idea of being quantitative about the customer experience is something that's really important. And there's probably a spectrum of approaches that companies take. And if you look at one end where it may be the most numbers, financially goal, quantifiable oriented, versus like the totally other end, which is, you're doing this just to learn and understand, and you don't really care about the numbers. You just want to you want to listen. You want to understand like the customer voice. You kind of want to be in the middle, right? So you could look on the one hand of like the side where you're just listening, and if you're just listening, then you're probably going to have a lack of action. And that relates back to the idea that if you can't measure something, you can't manage it. That expression that we've all heard before. If you just are listening and you don't care about numbers and you don't really care about anybody setting a target or a goal, you're going to lack action. But if you go, if you flip, pivot to the totally other end of the spectrum, and you're like only looking at the numbers, and you're treating customers as if they're like accounting numbers, financial entries in a ledger, then you're sort of losing the human element of it. Like you're losing, you're not talking about a customer anymore. You're talking about like literally a metric, or a digit, or a goal. So you want to aim. I don't know exactly what the middle is, and this relates to the previous point of, what does your company expect? Like, and is your culture a culture that leans more quantitative, or is your culture one that leans a little bit softer, a little bit more qualitative? You can flex the skills of your CX program one way or the other, but like the pitfall would probably be, watch out for when you cross the line, on one side versus the other. And if you sense that your stakeholders they're consuming your outputs and they're listening to your feedback, but they're just not doing anything with it, there's a lot of reasons why that can happen. But if it looks like the reason is like they don't care, they're not paying attention to the scores, doesn't matter to them, they're only reading customer quotes, that might be an indicator that you probably need to focus a little bit more on the scores and the numbers. And the same is true in the opposite direction. If it's like, if the customer is no longer a customer, but they're just a metric, then maybe you've gone a little bit too far on that direction too.
Right. Makes total sense. Awesome. And I think that's a great segue into our main talking points. So let's set the stage. The team has gathered the data, the surveys are out, and they've cleaned it up. We want to dive into segmentation and analysis. How do you typically break down your customer responses? What are the kind of cuts that you like to take or you recommend people take in an organization?
There are some obvious cuts that probably apply everywhere. And then there are some variables that are going to, as we keep discussing, like depend on the situation. So, whether you're looking at a net promoter score, or whether you're looking at a satisfaction score with a product, or a support experience, or some part of the journey, some milestone that a customer went through when they had an interaction with the company, some of those are gonna go really well, and that's reflected in the language of like promoters. Other parts of the experience are going to go really badly, and you're going to get 0 through 6 scores on an 11-point scale. So you're going to have promoters, you're going to have detractors, and of course you're going to want to segment like the great from the not so great. And it's very useful. Like, let's talk about net promoter for a minute. At that top level, the brand level, you want to know who your promoters are, and you want to know who your detractors are, and you want to know the root causes of promotion and detraction. It's like the starting point. So same is true if you have a really important product family in your company, like an anchor product, or like you're offering a service and there's like something that's strategic to the business, and you want to understand it better. You want to know what's going well, and you want to know what's not going well. So the idea of like a basic cut of promotion and detraction by survey or by listening post is pretty important. That's like a great starting point. And the audiences for those are also different. So start with detractors. That's usually the place where companies, they aim there first, like let's fix what's broken. In our company, that would be the products. Like we're a product company, software company, and we have products. And there's more that Oracle does than just products. There's a lot of support and consulting and things that go along with it, but like we sell products. So we want to know how customers think about those products. And if there's something wrong, we want to understand it and be able to fix it and improve it and improve the experience that customers have using the product. So the product teams and the engineers and the developers really want to understand detractor feedback. I'm sure they also want to know sort of end to end what's going well, but like they can action the detractor feedback. Marketing, on the other hand, marketing is inspired and motivated to act by, much more of the promoter feedback. These are referenceable accounts. They're customers that are delighted. Like, they'll write feedback about how much they love the company, the brand, or the products that they're using. And that's great information for marketing to understand. It's important to understand what factors drive the brand in a favorable way. It's important to understand like what messages are resonating out in the market that could be used for, for enhancing the brand and for other marketing purposes. So like actually my team creates a promoter perspective deck that's purely for marketing. So it's sort of like looking at all the feedback, but only through the lens of promotion. And that's like a great set of content that's published out to the marketing groups. So depending on your stakeholders, like you'll have a different audience for promoter detractor feedback, but it's also useful to start to understand what are the behaviors of promoters and detractors. This is a really, really critical element of analysis, is not only looking at the feedback and the scores, but it's tying it back to customer, to actual customer behavior. This is useful in the example of the telco to understand like, well, who's churning and who's not. So, who's complaining and staying. So maybe it's an issue, but not a big enough issue to make customers churn. And then who is like really complaining enough where they're gonna talk the talk and then walk the walk, favorably or unfavorably. That connection piece is really, really important. So like, promoter, back to your original question though, promoter detractor, what are the other ones underneath that may be more variable and depend on the situation? Every business has some strategic priorities. So the way that you are able to measure the success or not of those strategic priorities is an important segmentation cut. Like if you're a business and you're aiming customers towards a particular product because that's the future of the company, you want to be able to measure that. That would be an important cut. Like, how are we doing with this product versus the other products? If you're a company and you're trying to migrate customers to the newest version of your product, you might want to make a cut by newest version and other versions to be able to understand like how critical is this? Like are the other older versions falling way behind where it's an imperative and it's got to happen fast, or are they kind of on equal footing and it's not as critical from a timing perspective? I mean, the imperatives to the business, like the strategies that the business is focusing on, are really important to drive the way you think about like kind of cutting your feedback. But there are some simple tips. When you change the experience in some way, you want a before and an after view, right? Customers have to sign up for something to use the product. The steps used to be 10 complicated steps, and now it's like 2 simple steps. You want a score and you want an analysis of what was, what were customers talking about and what did that picture look like before the change and then after. So some change happened, get that comparative view. Like you're trying to decide which direction to go and you're running an A/B test. You want to be able to measure A versus B and not only look at a typical A/B test output of what's the behavior, but like what's the sentiment on top of the behavior of A versus B. So those are just some, those are some basics, but when you go beyond that, let the demand of what the business is asking of you drive a little bit of the way you approach, sort of the segmentation and the analysis. Could be by customer type, could be by region, could be by product, could be all sorts of ways, but I think the business will help guide you.
Totally makes sense. So let's say you have all your cuts down, you know how you're going to slice the data. Let's get into correlation analysis. What should teams keep in mind when doing correlation analysis and looking for overall trends?
Well, when you're looking for trends, one thing to keep in mind is you should be getting feedback at the right points in time. I was just on a call earlier today with a potential partner, and this person asked us about the way that we approach NPS, and said, "Are you doing this in a more relationship fashion where you're going in once a year, or are you doing it in a more transactional way where it's more frequent than that?" And I responded by, well, think of it like a relationship NPS survey happening monthly. So it's kind of both. And the reason I'm sharing that is if you want to understand any of these metrics, net promoter, product satisfaction, how support is going, I don't think it's going to do you as much good to get a view once a year as it would be to get the view once a month, because things change. Like the business is changing. You're constantly changing. The new customers are onboarding, and the experience is changing. And you don't want to lose the ability to understand how those things are impacting the experience. So, kind of, if you were to lay out all of the different metrics that you're asking about that reflect like all of the parts of the experience that you want to know about, the metrics that you use to rate those parts of the experience. And then, it's almost like you're kind of building out, who do you talk to? Like, what's the sampling strategy for each one of these? What's the interval that you ask them? Also, like, what's the trigger? For parts of the journey, the trigger is they went through the experience of what you want to measure. Like if you're measuring onboarding, a customer that just onboarded, that's kind of your big clue that you're going to want to ask them at that point in time about onboarding. If you're talking about just brand net promoter, where you're asking likelihood to recommend, I like to do that monthly, because you get that cadence going. You start to understand not only what happens when you make changes, but what's happening when there's a change in the market. What happens when there's a competitive change? What happens from just pure seasonality? Like, is there something different that happens during the holidays versus the summertime that you weren't really thinking about until you saw it in the cadence? So, the intervals, like a monthly interval for a lot of what I measure is kind of that's what I aim for. Sometimes it's not possible, and maybe that's because the set of customers you have to work with isn't big enough, so you don't have enough customers to ask monthly. And then maybe you look to quarterly and sort of see if that works, or you kind of you can aggregate feedback over time and do a rolling 6-month view, or a rolling 12-month view if you need to kind of stack it up for that long to be able to have enough of an end count to make it meaningful. So the idea of trending, you have to have the feedback coming in frequently enough to actually do trending. And then once you get there, what is it that you want to look at? Like what do you want to know and trend over time? Some of the basics we talked about. You want to know the actual scores. you want to know the distribution between like percent promoters, passives, and detractors to understand like what kind of movement is happening underneath the score. I had a statistician who worked for me at eBay who shared an example of a score moving from 45 to 55 that was not statistically significant, and then a score going from 50 to 50 that was statistically significant because of all the movement underneath, like promoters dropping, detractors moving up, and all the change that was going on underneath. And there's a lot that affects like the statistical significance of these net scores. But I think just understanding that like you want to not only track the number, but the movement, that's an important point. And then you want to look at like the categories of the open-ended comments that are coming back. You want to look at the attributes that you're having customers rate that support Net Promoter in this case, or a satisfaction metric. Like what's underneath that top level metric that you're also measuring. And when you're trending all of that over time, it's pretty interesting to look at what kind of change happens in the topics customers talk about when you actually implement a fix. Does the discussion go away? Like, is it that you pushed on one part of the balloon and fixed an issue, and then like another issue popped up on the other side of the balloon? Like maybe, but like you want to trend those open-ended comments. You want to trend the attributes, and then you want to look at how they move over time in relation to one another. So like very basic regression analysis can help you understand which attributes are influencing movements in the Net Promoter Score more than others. And once you know that, like that's a pretty important indicator of what matters most to your customers. This is another pitfall, right? Like you'll look at the scores that customers rate. And we had talked about frequency of mention. Now this one relates to just absolute numbers of scores. Like if you rate 10 attributes and there's a nice Pareto chart where some of them you're doing really well, others are kind of at the tail end and you're doing quite badly. There is a temptation to like look at the worst rated attribute and say, we need to fix this because this is an important part of our business. Like customers love our products, but they hate our salespeople, or they love our salespeople, but they hate our support. Like there's some story there, and it might be that the lowest rated. What if the lowest rated comment is that you're expensive? I don't think any company out there would look at that and say, well, we need to just drop our prices tomorrow. Like that, that might be an example, an obvious example where, you wouldn't necessarily do that. You might look at what value are customers getting, like which products do they use when they talk about being too expensive, and then like, hey, are they getting the real value out of that? Do they realize like that there's other stuff that could be done, or like what went? That's a great topic to try to understand. And I would say that like any score that's low would be like a great topic to try to understand like what's going on underneath it. But just because it's a low number doesn't mean that it's the most important attribute to fix first. So, that kind of regression of like trying to sort through which attributes matter the most, and then kind of step two, going back to like, well, where are we on these attributes? Got it. So the first attribute that matters the most, we're doing great on that attribute. We need to do more of it. Let's protect, how well we're doing on that dimension. But some of the ones like, what about if number 2 is the lowest rated one? Well, maybe, that's a good indicator that that's got to get some focus. So, this is just coming out of the basic architecture of the survey structure that we talked about, and using that as a way of kind of informing analysis and interpretation and prioritization, and then, kind of actions that will come from it.
And then there's the component of the open-ended feedback, which only adds more value to that kind of analysis. So some companies may gather thousands of open-ended responses. I'm sure you deal with that at Oracle, you've dealt with that at eBay and McAfee. And these can be really, really long comments. Like some customers can give you a sentence, a word, or a paragraph. How should CX teams tackle qualitative data in order to uncover those insights? Should people be using brute force and going through it manually? Should they be looking at automated solutions, or a combination of both?
Well, the qualitative feedback it's super useful, and it's useful in a couple ways. It's useful in understanding what's going on. Like, what is it that, I mean, this is where customers are really explaining to you what's going well and what's not going well. So like, just reading these comments, thousands of comments sounds like a lot. That was what you said in your example. Like, you see thousands of these. You and I could sort through thousands of comments in the time that we've already spent on this discussion today. Like, you know, each comment could take a couple seconds, and you can really go through and read a lot of customer comments in a relatively short amount of time. So like, I think that they're really important for analysis and interpretation purposes. Like, you get this sort of color commentary that explains what's going on. Super useful there. But like, the bigger, I think it's bigger, like the bigger utility out of this qualitative feedback is the use in kind of changing behavior and customer centricity in the company. Like, this is if you think of what I said, where like, you can go through 1,000 customer comments pretty quickly. There are a lot of employees in every company that, you know, that they never see what customers are talking about. They, you know, maybe or rarely see it. Some people are engaging with customers all the time, and a large majority of employees are not. So if you spent 10 minutes reading customer quotes, you can often get a really good picture of what customers think of you. And, you know, getting the voice of the customer out to employees is such a big deal in terms of driving customer centricity in the culture and driving sort of empathy and just understanding for what customers go through. It applies in almost every function in the organization. When you go out and start collecting feedback, at first, you know, you can sort of guess what customers are going to talk about, and, you know, maybe directionally executives that are close to customers might come up with a story, not with the quantification and, you know, not with the type of presentation that we're talking about. But over time, and it's not that long of a time, but over time, you end up with a taxonomy of issues. Like, you end up knowing pretty well what's the framework of what detractors talk about. And maybe the percentages change over time, but like, you know, if it relates to 4 topics, if it relates to product and support and sales and, you know, I don't know, pick another one, but like, if it relates to 3 or 4 issues, 6 months from now, they're not going to radically change. Like, it's not going to be 4 completely different issues driving Net Promoter 6 months from now than today. So, you know, how do you come to that taxonomy? You know, I guess it depends on how far you are into like listening and interpreting the feedback. What also evolves though is like the way you action it. And I think this, you know, this is worth putting some time in now or later of, you know, how, you know, what are the roles of the different teams in actioning the feedback. So put that on the to-do list for at the appropriate time.
Yeah, we're going to tackle that in part 3 with the action phase. This is a bit of a curveball. You talk about culture and you talk about being either too quantitative or too qualitative. When I think about customer quotes, there's usually the good, the bad, and the ugly. And some organizations don't want to deal with the ugly. How does a CX leader bring that to the forefront in front of a product team or in an executive team and make them comfortable with reading that kind of feedback?
In your question, how are you defining the ugly?
Like, your product is terrible or your experience is really bad, and the customers are just really ripping on whatever that is you're measuring, whether it's your brand, your product, your customer success team, or your customer journey.
Got it. So it's your baby is ugly.
Yeah, yeah, your baby is ugly, effectively.
Right. Well, this illustrates why it's so important. I'm going back to data, okay? It illustrates why it's so important to go back and collect the information the right way. If you just go into a room of product people and start telling them that customers are complaining about their product, they don't like it, they don't like the features, they don't, they have a hard time setting it up, like whatever it is, I don't think that by itself will go over very well. But if you have a scorecard of products and you're able to flash up on the screen, like let's just say the company sells 10 products, and there's you have 10 rows, and on each row is the name of each of the 10 products. And right next to it is the customer satisfaction score. And 9 out of the 10 are above an 8, and the 10th out of 10 is a 4.2. Like, let the data speak. Let that tell the story. And it really shouldn't be you telling anybody that the customer's good, that the product is good or bad, or that whatever you're rating is good or bad. It's that, hey, look, we have 10 scores and 9 of them are above an 8 and 1 of them is at a 4. We've broken that apart so we understand what's behind it. And who knows, like maybe what's behind it is that we talked about the version issue as an example. Maybe all the 9 products, a majority of customers are on the current version. Maybe on that last product that's lagging in the score, the customer base is on like old generations of the product, and that's why it's not working in their environment. I don't know, but like imagine if you came into the meeting and just told the product owner of the 4.2 rated product that customers think their product's terrible, versus your score's 4.2. We've analyzed why. Here's the root cause. These are the things that we need to do differently to correct for it. And like, then you're not telling them that their baby's ugly. You're just explaining like what customers are rating, why they rated it that way, and then what you need to do about it. And that's kind of the holy grail of what we're talking about with all this work anyway. You want to know what customers are saying, you want to know what to do about it, and then you want to see some sort of an improvement. So, the more you can come to the table with like objective data, and the more you can represent the customer as an impartial, objective third party in the company, I think the less you're going to run into that problem.
And that's a great segue into the last topic, which is related to presenting the results. So you did talk about that, of like, you need to keep in mind that you're essentially guiding that leader or the stakeholder through the data and letting the data speak for itself. What is your preferred method of showing the results? Do you like to use presentations or dashboards, or is it a combination of both depending on the audience?
Well, this definitely is a big topic, and the answer, not surprisingly, is it depends on the situation, right? Think about it in like the stages of maturity. Okay. If you start off out of the gate without any feedback at all, trying to build custom dashboards, like, imagine the feedback that will go into them. Like some companies do this. Like they'll start with like, we're going to build a dashboard for product. We're going to build a dashboard for this marketing branding group. We're going to have all these views. And now we have to go get the feedback and like populate the views. To me, that's out of order. I think there has to be there's actually a lot of work involved in, sort of synthesizing things and landing on issues and framing, the way they're categorized and the way you name them, and like the way that everything gets presented that actually resonates with your stakeholders. And that takes some trial and error. So when you've engaged and done things manually for a while, for a period of time with presentations, and it's kind of some heavy lifting, but when you do that well and you learn what works and what doesn't work, then you've got your answer for what to populate, what to build. and you're probably going to have a higher adoption rate of the dashboards, and the stakeholders are going to use them more if they know what they're going to get, they know how to interpret it, and now at a certain point you've just automated it for them, and you say, hey, look, now like the content that we've met and talked about every month for the last 6 months, here's the link. Now you can go to it before the meeting and you can check out all these views and things that we've created for you. I think, the bottom line is you need both, and you need to kind of feel out like what's the right solution in your environment. I would emphasize like engagement over, the form. You want stakeholders to be working with you closely and engaged. And the only call out from like dashboards and systems is that you want to make sure that you retain some level of accountability over the engagement. And I know not everybody feels this way. I know that managers I've reported to before like did not feel this way. That they're sort of like, let's build it, and then that's the end of your responsibility. I feel like if that leads to suboptimal actions, that it's really not the end of my responsibility, that like it goes to that next level of ensuring that they actually do something with it.
And ultimately that master deck that your team creates, if they're not leveraging dashboards to help define what that sophisticated model or maturity will look like, do you ever limit the size of that story, or do you essentially build the deck that lets you have a conversation with every part of the organization, and you're just tweaking it to fit their needs? So effectively, it's a long deck.
Take it back to the data. I would build the sampling strategy, and I would build the measurement system so that whatever view we want to create in whatever master deck or subset of that we're going to create, we can go into that big pot of feedback and yank it out, right? So the idea of some complete, master set of feedback, it can get pretty big, and I wouldn't limit that. I mean, if you had a standard generic 20-slide overview, and maybe the first slide is just the trending of Net Promoter, and then you've got the topics that come through and the attributes and some root cause analysis and whatever it is that breaks, maybe it's 10 slides, maybe it's 20 slides. That's it. But then like, what if your company is interested in a regional view? Then you have to take those 10 or 20 slides and repeat it for North America, Europe, APAC, Latin America, and then 20 becomes 80 or 100 with the original 20. And then what about if you want different cuts? So like, of course that could get extremely big, but I don't think you need that. I think you need to have the ability to tap into the views that people want to see when they want to see it. This is where I think the idea of tools and dashboards can be really effective, because let's assume that you retain that cadence of like a collaborative action meeting on a monthly basis. What do you bring to the table in that meeting? Like, do you want to have to go and recreate content in a presentation form, or do you want to have a dashboard where you can go to pull it out? Like this is a great example where you can kind of use the idea of a platform, a dashboard for efficiency and scalability, but you're doing it in a way where you're still connected to the stakeholders. Maybe the dashboard customer is you, and you're the one that's going in and pulling out what you need for the meetings. Like the best case scenario would be everybody knows what they need to do. People are proactive about going and doing it. Stakeholders, frequently go in, take what they need. They drive actions. They're measured against the outcome from like the customer experience, and that's just that's not a reality in most companies. And back to your original question from the day today about what are some of the pitfalls, I think that's a pitfall. assuming that people will do what you want them to do, or like what the leadership team wants them to do, and improve the experience, and make sure that they follow through with, with some of these topics that come through from like the listening post. It may or may not happen.
Have any examples of when an organization, to your point just now that you made, of when an organization gets it and you can move quickly versus it just takes a long time? Because I'm sure a lot of people and CX leaders or practitioners are thinking like, God, when is this going to work? Like when is it going to be an inflection point? And I could see this is just like a smooth rolling machine.
I mentioned to you when we first started the discussion that I've done work with startups before, and I think like the early stage companies, the startups, they move quickly, and they're gonna, very naturally just get to a place where things will happen quickly, and if they're going to adopt it, it's going to get done. So in that environment, it's fast, and if there's support for it, I think it can be adopted and work really well, really quickly. Bigger companies, there's a lot more heavy lifting involved. Certainly if you're talking about like Fortune 500, 1000, like mega global companies, it's a lot of work. And it takes heavy lifting to kind of change the culture, to sort of drive a new way of thinking into a big company. So size of the company is one way of looking at that. Other companies that have sort of built it in from the beginning. I mean, everybody talks about Apple and others where, there's a few other companies that are known for great customer focus and customer centricity. And so I think, having that built into the DNA of the culture of the company sort of, that certainly helps when it starts that way from the beginning. And like, I suspect that if you looked at these startups and followed them through their growth cycles, the ones that paid attention at the beginning are going to have it embedded, and it'll be quite natural in the future. And then the ones that, that didn't and then grow to be quite big will have their challenges.
I think that's a great segue into part 3, where we're going to get into action. We're going to talk a bit about culture, governance, helping promote customer centricity, and then ultimately building out that last part of a successful CX program.